All right, we are in Deuteronomy chapter 22 this morning. Deuteronomy 22. And at this point, of course, we're in the specific stipulations of the covenant. And the laws are starting to get more and more random, or at least from our perspective, they might seem a little bit more random in that we can't really discern why they're ordered the way they are. But nevertheless, we shall continue reading, and we'll just take each passage one at a time. Beginning in verse 1, "You shall not see your countryman's ox or his sheep straying away and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly bring them back to your countryman. If your countryman is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it home to your house, and it shall remain with you until your countryman looks for it. Then you will restore it to him. Thus you shall do with his donkey, you shall do the same with his garment, you shall do likewise with anything lost by your countryman, which he has lost and you have found. You are not allowed to neglect them. You shall not see your countryman's donkey or his ox fallen down on the way, and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly help him to raise them up." All right, so what's the point of this law?
Finders, keepers, losers, weepers.
Wrong.
It's in the good book.
Wrong. The opposite of that is not finders, keepers. It is, if you find it, you give it back to the person who lost it. Don. Being considerate, okay. There's a phrase repeated 3 times in this, or a principle repeated 3 times in these 4 verses, and what was it? Jenna. Well, no, you're right about that. It's definitely part of the overall principle of loving your neighbor as yourself. But what's the phrase repeated 3 times in there? Or the principle repeated 3 times? Restore it to your countryman. You shall bring it back to restore it to him. Okay, I guess that might be repeated 3 times too. That wasn't what I was looking for. 4. Oh, see. It was 4 times, but okay. Yes, you shall restore it to your countrymen, but what was the other thing? Verse 1, verse 3, verse 4. You shall not what?
You shall not keep their animal.
Okay, you shall keep the animal. You shall not neglect them. Yes, thank you. You shall not neglect them, or my version said, you don't. It says you pay no attention to them. You shall not pay no attention to them. It's weird the way it's worded here, but you shall not neglect them is the idea in this context. Do not ignore it. In verse 1, you shall not see your countryman's ox or sheep straying away and pay no attention to them. Verse 3. You are not allowed to neglect them. Verse 4, you shall not see your countryman's donkey or ox fallen down and pay no attention to them. In other words, you can't just ignore a situation going on over here or a situation going on over there. You can't just neglect something that you see lost or wandering away or injured and walk past it. It is wrong to willfully ignore a dangerous situation. Okay, now all of that said, there's also this principle of respect for life in here as well. The Bible says a couple things about, even the life of animals. A righteous man has regard for the life of his animal, but even the compassion of the wicked is cruel. Proverbs 12 and verse 10. The righteous is concerned for the rights of the poor. The wicked does not understand such concerns. Proverbs 29 and verse 7. And so the idea behind all of this is that you don't just ignore things your neighbor might be losing, or you don't just find things your neighbor has lost and keep them for yourself or ignore them. You make sure that your neighbor has his property restored to him. Any questions on that? All right, verses 5 through 12 is kind of the heading in my Bible says sundry laws. That implies that there really isn't any organization to it, but let's read this. Verse 5, "A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. If you happen to come upon a bird's nest along the way, in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall certainly let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, in order that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, so that you will not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone falls from it. You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, or all the produce of the seed which you have sown, and the increase of the vineyard will become defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and linen together. You shall make for yourselves tassels on the four corners of your garment with which you cover yourself. Okay. And there's definitely, I think, anybody see a connection between all these laws that we just read? Besides that, you shall not. Most of the laws in the Old Testament are you shall not or you shall. So, I mean, that connects them all together. Don't do this, do this. Those are what we call apodictic laws. And casuistic is if this happens, then this happens. That's the other kind of law we get. What's the other thing that connects them all together?
There are some of the things you might say are dissimilar things, such as a man putting on a woman's clothing, in the bird's nest taking the mother with the young, dissimilar things. The parapet on the house, that one is not really dissimilar. Sowing your vineyard with two kinds of seed, plowing with an ox and a donkey, wearing mixed materials, and then the tassels on the four corners of your garment are not really.
Yeah, there's definitely. I haven't been able to come up. I haven't been able to come up with a single label to just pigeonhole all these into. There is, I think, definitely, a transition between the previous section we were reading on respect for life and what we're coming up on next, which is marital fidelity. I think that there's a focus on, being faithful to the covenant in that context. But
I think we might put as one abiding theme here is perhaps personal responsibility in here.
Yeah.
There is a theme, a thread of personal responsibility running through each of these things.
Well, that definitely connects with what comes before it too. I mean, you have the, you don't just ignore situations with your neighbor's property. You have a personal responsibility to help him. There's something to that too. Jenna, do you have something? I don't have a good answer for that because I don't know anything about agriculture. Never took a horticulture class or anything like that. She wanted to know why in the world would you sow your field with two kinds of seed? And probably because you want to grow, I guess you want to grow multiple crops together. But let's talk about these one. Where Don, you have something?
Well, as far as that let a field of grass out there. You gotta remember where you planted what. Because if you keep planting the same thing,
There might be.
You want to rotate crops.
There might be something to that. I mean, people put that forth as the reason for the sabbatical law. Luis.
I just see it is that you don't mix things to keep earth on each side.
Right, and I think that's the real point that he is getting across here. Which, you look at the things surrounding this. Don't sow two kinds of seed. Don't plow with an ox and two different kinds of animals. Because why? Because they're unequally yoked. Don't wear material mixed of wool and linen. How many people are breaking this law right now? I'm wondering. Two different kinds of fabric. Something to think about. But no polyester. And the point isn't that, two different kinds of fabric mixed together is somehow inherently evil. The point is, the symbolic lesson that God's trying to teach Israel that, you don't mix things together. You don't mix the common and the holy. You don't mix the clean and the unclean. Just like you don't mix two different kinds of seed, two different kinds of animals, two different kinds of fabrics. Yes, Jenna?
I guess grafting. I guess grafting.
Grafting? Grafting different kinds of fruit into different kinds of trees. There's examples of that.
But you
Scripture,
have to have. You can't graft a citrus onto a completely different type of fruit tree. It won't work.
Well, it won't take, but
for example, there might be something to do with this in the come ye out from among them and be ye separate.
Yeah, there's definitely that element to it.
Keep yourself separate from the rest of the world and uncontaminated from the Canaanites and those others that you're, in whose land you dwell, and drive them out and don't let them stay.
Right. There's definitely a principle of separation there. Jenna, you had something.
I was only mentioning references.
Oh, Romans 11. Okay, yeah. Romans 11 with the olive tree. All right. Just a couple of other random things in here. Cross-dressing is brought up in verse 5. Why is that forbidden? He calls it an abomination. He uses the same word that he uses of homosexuality, I might add, a toeva. He uses that same word of idolatry, too. Why is that so bad? Man wearing women's clothing, women wearing men's clothing. Something to that, I've ever been in it's a horrible situation. My wife and I will be driving and we'll see somebody by the side of the road, and I go, man, this is awful. I thought that was a man, and I looked closer and I realized it was a woman. And Jenna goes, really? She said, I thought that was a woman, and I looked closer and I realized it was a man. That's when we know you're in trouble. You can't even agree on what you disagreed about. There is something said about the way you dress, and I don't think the point is just sheer appearance. The point is that God made them male and female in the beginning, and they're not supposed to be mixing that either. They're not really supposed to be interfering with that. Jenna, you got something?
I guess you're not supposed to
No, you're not. That God created both male and female in the image of God, so He created them equal in value, but He created them with distinct roles at the same time, and they need to make sure that they each play their roles as is necessary and don't deviate from that. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 11, the famous passage about the head covering that everybody gets excited about, isn't that really just an expansion of this principle right here in the law? A man shall not wear women's clothing, and a woman shall not wear man's clothing. That's really the point that Paul's getting across. It's not that Paul's trying to invent some special ordinance about a doily that you're supposed to wear on your head. He's saying, no, God has a certain order or a certain hierarchy that He wants people to act in terms of God, just as God is the head of Christ, man is the head of woman. But Christ is God. Well, yeah, but He's still, God is still the head of Christ, and He describes it in that way. And it's the same thing in 1 Corinthians 11. He says you don't mix those roles. You don't try to cross those boundaries by wearing the clothes of the other gender. Jenna, you have something.
I guess Mulan's
No, Mulan is not a very good role model. You are correct. In chapter, then in verses 6 and 7 we have the mother with the young. And you don't take the mother and her eggs at the same time. You take the eggs, but you let the mother go. What is the point of that?
Well, if you keep on taking the mother with the eggs, one thing is that this is just, you're not going to have any more eggs.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the old story of the goose who laid the golden egg. The husband and wife finally thought, hey, all that gold's in the goose. If we kill the goose and cut it open, we'll have more gold than ever before. They cut open the goose and it was nothing but a goose. So they got no more golden eggs, and it was gone. So that's kind of the principle here as far as physical things go. But I think the other thing is equity. God demands from His people equity, that they be equitable toward everyone. And if you go and you marry a daughter and the daughter's mother, that was prohibited in the law. That's not equity. If you take the mother with the young, that's just not equity. If you boil a young goat in its mother's milk, that's just perverse. Even from the human reasoning standpoint, that's just perverse.
I was going to bring us to that. Boiling a goat in its mother's milk follows the same thought process. In Leviticus 22:28, the law forbids sacrificing an animal and its young in the same day. You don't kill them both in the same day. And why not? Well, because there is some kind of significance to that in terms of the extinguishing of life. And, sacrificing a mother and its young at the same time, you might as well just wipe out the whole species for that matter. That's not what God wants. And it's the same thing here. This principle applies in the wild as well. You take the eggs, you leave the mother so she can produce more eggs, and so that life can continue. And there's an interesting fact about all of this. The rabbis referred to verses 6 and 7 as the least of all the commandments. So, I don't know why they did it that way. They gave a hierarchy to the commandments, but they called this the least of the commandments. Jesus said, whoever annuls the least of the commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So, don't know if he's referring specifically to this, but, interesting fact anyway. Jenna?
I guess also
You
you don't leave the young to die.
don't leave the young to die with... Yeah, that's true too. I mean, you take the mother, the young aren't going to survive. You take the eggs, the mother can always produce more eggs. That's the idea, I think, again, that's in the law here. The law's not interested in just abjectly, cruelly destroying animals with no purpose. God gave plants and animals to mankind for a reason, so that he could eat and sustain himself. And they need to be used for that purpose, and not just for, wanton, pointless destruction.
Yeah, you hit upon it there. God created nature for man. He did not create nature for its own good. But showing respect toward nature is one way that we do show respect toward God.
Right. There's definitely an element of that in the text as well, I think. Parapets on the house. Why is that necessary? Don?
Well, in our times, one of the reasons why but next year it talks about somebody falling off the roof, bringing blood guilt upon themselves. Apparently, that parapet
How many people here have parapets on the roof of their house? Nobody. What? But what if somebody falls off your roof? Well, I mean, their roofs were flat. Ours are typically slanted today. So, I mean, we don't have the same issue that they did. But if somebody falls off your roof, you're held accountable. You, as part of loving your neighbor as yourself, have an obligation to make sure that people aren't fearing for their life when they come into your home or when they visit your home. So that's one of the principles of this. If you cause an injury, even if it's just due to negligence, if you cause an injury due to negligence, you are still accountable for that. You are still guilty for that. So the principle is here, loving your neighbor as yourself. If you love your neighbor, you will take the necessary measures to ensure his safety.
Over in India, they still build houses a lot the same way they build them here. You go up on the rooftop. Their roofs up there are concrete roofs, poured concrete. And so you actually use the roof of the house as part of the house. And in hot weather, people will actually sleep up there and so forth. And they have stairs going up there, and that's the way they did here. And so people were up on the roof of the house a lot. I mean, I preached on a lot of rooftops when I was in India because that was the gathering place.
Proclaim it from the rooftops.
So, they had people walking around on their rooftop, gathering, having parties, things like this. And if you just had a walk-off, I mean, somebody get hurt.
Verses 9 through 11, actually, we already talked about symbolic reminders of holiness. Verse 12, what's the purpose of the tassels? Have we seen this anywhere before? Jenna? Numbers 15, all right, verses 37 through 41. And what was the point of the tassels in Numbers 15? Anybody remember? To remember God's laws, right. They're visual reminders of holiness. When they look at the tassels, they are supposed to remember the commandments of God. The tassels are similar to the phylacteries in Deuteronomy chapter 6, where it says you'll bind them as frontals on your forehead and on your arms and all that. It's a visual reminder of the commandments. Now, in the New Testament times, the Pharisees, they had made tassels and phylacteries into a status symbol. They lengthened their tassels, and they broadened their phylacteries, because, I have bigger tassels and broader frontlets than you do. I must be more holy than you, because I must remember the commandments better than you. That's not the point of these laws, is, look at me, I'm special. The point is, for self-reflection and, the reminder of one's own holiness. Jenna?
Or you may need a bigger reminder.
Need a bigger reminder. You need a bigger reminder because you're not getting it. It's not getting through your head. So you need longer tassels. Because you could kind of turn that on its head. This is typological of the Spirit's work in some respect. Jesus said that the Spirit that He would send would remind us of all things in John 14:26 and John 16 and verses 13 through 15. And the reason why is because it's the Spirit's job to write the law on our hearts. Instead of having the law written on our clothing, we write the law on our hearts now. That's part of the new covenant of Deuteronomy 31 and verses 31 through 34. They will no longer teach each man his brother and each man his neighbor, saying, "Know the Lord," because they will all know me. I will write my law on their hearts and on their minds, and I will remember their sins no more. All of that. There's this definite need to have the law on our hearts today, and it's not that there's anything wrong with putting visual reminders around your home or even on yourself to remind yourself of what the Scripture says. But ultimately, the real reminders need to be in here, inside you, so that because if all you do is read the Bible, gloss over the words on the page, and then you never change who you are or what you are, what good did it do you, really? It's that ultimately the commandments and the laws of God need to be written on our hearts. That's the goal of the covenant. Anything up through verse 12? Everybody, this is a much more exciting section than I thought it would be. Verses 13 through pretty much the end of the chapter talk about marital fidelity. And we start off with what is probably one of the strangest laws in the Pentateuch. If any man takes a wife and goes into her and then turns against her and charges her with shameful deeds and publicly defames her and says, "I took this woman, but when I came near her, I did not find her a virgin," then the girl's father and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of the girl's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. The girl's father shall say to the elders, "I gave my daughter to this man for a wife, and he turned against her. Behold, he has charged her with shameful deeds, saying, I did not find your daughter a virgin. But this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. They shall spread the garment before the elders of the city. The elders of that city shall take the man and chastise him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father, because he publicly defamed him to Virgin of Israel. She shall remain his wife. He cannot divorce her all his days. But if this charge is true, that the girl was not found a virgin, then they shall bring out the girl to the doorway of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death, because she has committed an act of folly in Israel by playing the harlot in her father's house. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you." Okay. Now this is kind of an unusual law. It's kind of like in Numbers 5 where we had the adultery test. The man charges his newlywed bride with infidelity. She's not a virgin, he says. And which, there's a principle here that betrothal is basically, on par with marriage in terms of the demands for faithfulness that come with them. If you commit adultery, if you sleep with somebody else while you're engaged to somebody, it's considered the same thing as adultery and carries the same penalty. Now, if the parents could prove her virginity, this man's going to be beaten and fined. And if he can disprove it, she's stoned as a convicted adulteress. Now everybody asks the inevitable question, well, how would she prove her virginity? Jenna, do you have something? Oh. How would she prove her virginity? And, they spread out this garment. It's probably this blood on the sheets thing that takes place. And if they could prove this, it ends badly for the husband. But why is this law here? That's the real question we got to ask.
When Amnon longs for Tamar, David's son, and was Amnon and Tamar?
Yes, Amnon and Tamar.
Son and daughter, and they were half brother and sister. And he longed for her, and he feigned sickness, and so David was asked, and he sent Tamar in to nurse him, and he took her and forced her, and then once he had his way with her, he didn't want her anymore. And this can happen. A man longs for a girl, and then she becomes his, and some men are just despicable. It's the only way I know how to say it. Some men are just despicable. Mm-hmm. And so this can happen. And so then the guy starts making stuff up to try to defame her and get rid of her so he can move on. And
right.
This is to protect the woman, because women didn't really, in that culture, did not really have any rights. They came from a culture in Egypt where women were basically chattel property. And so they're kind of coming out of that thought process now, and Moses is saying, look, women are valuable, and you You need to understand that. They're God's children too.
Right, right. Jenna has something. Yeah, that dawned on me too. If you have somebody who rises up as a false witness in Deuteronomy 19, I believe it was, and you accuse somebody of a crime and it turns out to be a false accusation, you get whatever penalty you were trying to get for them. Which, you're going, wasn't this the opposite of that? And, in point of fact, she can't be put to death unless there are witnesses. And if you can't prove it either way, you can't prove it either way. If they can disprove it, he gets publicly defamed. And that's the real point here.
And has to support her all the rest of
And see, here's the thing now. If she can't prove that she's a virgin, but he can't prove that she isn't, then there's no further discussion. That's the thing I think that people overlook on this. It says that, if the charge is true that the girl was not found a virgin, in other words, you have to actually be able to prove this charge, then she's put to death. But if in other words, this guy is making a real accusation and, he's really concerned about this, that's one thing. But if he's just trying to, defame her and it's all a lie and the parents can prove otherwise, this guy gets beaten in public. And that's the real point here. Jenna?
Because if this girl is now no longer a virgin, any way it turns out, she's no longer a virgin, is she marriable?
No.
Probably not. And so if they stone this man to death, she has no means of support for the rest of her life except to live in her parents' house. Now, to make the man support her for the rest of his life and make her a wife that he cannot put away is actually, in a sense, a punishment to him, but it also protects her and gives her a means of support.
I don't know if that's totally the answer to it. That may come into play, but I guess the main thing here is that nobody's claiming eyewitness testimony to all of this. He's bringing up a charge that until it's proven. Now, if there had been witnesses that popped up and said, "Oh yeah, I saw her. She did this," and they were lying, then yes, they'd be put to death for that. I think. I don't know. I'll be honest. This is a confusing passage, and I don't have all the answers on it. One thing I do think this is important, though, is that this law is designed to protect against what is called dowry deaths, where husbands who wanted more in bridal gifts than the family can afford would basically, they would sometimes abuse and kill their brides even, so that they could remarry and obtain more gifts. The emphasis here is on the man's punishment. He's flogged, he's fined, he's banned from divorcing her. He has to support her all his days. There's 100 shekels, which just, the average dowry was 50 shekels, so he's paying double is basically what happens. He doesn't get a wedding gift. He has to pay back double for all of this. And he is punished and humiliated if he's making false accusations. I haven't really been able to figure out how it fits totally into Deuteronomy 19. One thing I am almost certain of is that if you can't prove the charge either way, nothing happens to anybody. If you can't prove that if you can't prove that she was doing anything, then she can't be put to death, because you can't put people to death without 2 or 3 witnesses. And if you can prove that she's a virgin, then he gets beaten and flogged. Now that's the idea behind this. It's kind of, it kind of gives him an incentive not to do this. I don't have a lot of other good answers to that other than to say this is one of the most confusing things in the law. It's right up there with the adultery test in Numbers 5. So, any other comments or questions before we move on to a slightly easier section? Verse 22, if a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. If there is a girl who is a virgin engaged to another man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death, the girl because she did not cry out in the city, and the man because he has violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. But if in the field the man finds the girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death, for just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. When he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to help. Well, there was no one to save her. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin who is not engaged, and humbles her, and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. She shall become his wife, because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. A man shall not take his father's wife, so that he will not uncover his father's skirt. Now, there's some discrepancy on the way that this passage is translated, and we'll get to that. First of all, in verses 23 and 24, just on those verses for now, what principle does the law give about engagements?
As binding as the marriage contract.
Yes, exactly. Main principle that this scenario is meant to establish is that even if the marriage hasn't been consummated, having sex with an engaged girl still constitutes adultery and still carries the death penalty. Just like in verse 22, penalty for adultery is death, and that's just reiterating stuff that we've heard earlier. You do that with an engaged girl, it counts as the same as adultery, which actually explains Joseph's dilemma in chapter 1 of Matthew chapter 1, where he's kind of questioning whether he should put Mary away quietly. He doesn't want to get her in trouble, but he doesn't want to carry out the marriage either. So his dilemma is definitely related to this passage. If this happens in an urban area, it's further noted that the girl did not cry out for help, which means that this must have been consensual, because it can't be considered rape, because she would have screamed for help otherwise, and people in a closely compacted urban area would have come and helped her. But since it wasn't that, then the woman must die. It says the man is said to have. The word that it's used here is the man is said to have violated his neighbor's wife. Not in the sense of violating her in the sense of rape, but violating her in the sense of, he seduced her. And in the sense of adultery, right? All right. And that term's important later on. We're going to come back to that. Verses 25 through 27. What is the penalty for rape in the law? What happens to a rapist? They die. Yes, it's considered the exact same thing as murder. The law orders the death of a rapist. Now, it says specifically singles out that she's an engaged girl, but there's no real reason to distinguish between, whether the girls are engaged or single or virgin or not betrothed, it doesn't really make a big difference, because the principle is that it is just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. This is not a good thing. The penalty for rape is death. This is the only of the three scenarios to use the term forces, or chazak, which means to be strong against something, and later used of Amnon's rape of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13 in verses 11 and 14. Rape is equivalent with murder, and there's nothing in the context that I can see that is intrinsic as to whether this girl is engaged or not that is in keeping, that makes this crime any less atrocious. And no contextual limitation on applying this passage to the rape of an unengaged woman. So if it's happened in the field, it's assumed she's cried for help. Verses 28 and 29. Now, this is where the translations start to argue with each other a little bit, and there's no reason for it because, for example, the NIV, the NET will use the word rape in verses 28 and 29. But the context does not warrant this, because it's the same word that's used, the same term is used of this that's used for verses 23 and 24, but not for verses 25 through 27. Now that's kind of an important thing here. We have the term violated, which in verses 23 and 24, Anah was not talking about rape, but was talking about humbling her in that sense. Basically what we've got here is that context should be the controlling factor in translation. In verses 28 and 29, if a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, the man who lay with her shall give to his girl's father 50 shekels of silver. She shall become his wife because he has violated her or humbled her. He cannot divorce her all his days. This is not talking about rape, it's talking about seduction. Sometimes you'll hear people who don't like the Bible, who are skeptics of the Bible, they'll quote this passage and say, oh, well, the Bible commanded a woman to marry her rapist. But that's not true. It's not what the text says. And in fact, the context shows quite the opposite. The Bible commanded that a rapist was to be put to death. And a person who seduces a woman, on the other hand, and it seems to me that verses 28 and 29 was consensual, that this is in fact the penalty for premarital sex, that was not adulterous, that nobody's engaged, nothing like that. In that situation, the man is required to marry her. He can't just use her for his pleasure and then dispose of her. He has to keep her. He cannot divorce her all his days. And he has to pay 50 shekels of silver. Again, I said that was the typical dowry price. It further demands that a man who had sex with a woman was entitled to marry her. He cannot seduce her for his personal pleasure and then leave her destitute without any real commitment. And let me ask you this. Does anybody else have veto power in this situation? Jenna? The woman's father has veto power. You don't get this from Deuteronomy. You get this from the parallel law in Exodus chapter 22 in verses 16 and 17. Which I have it written here. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the dowry for virgins. So the father has veto power on the situation. The father has the right to say, no, I don't want you marrying my daughter, but you still got to pay up. So no matter what this man does, he has to pay. But unless the father says otherwise, he also has to marry her, and he cannot divorce her all his days. That's the basic point of this text. And finally, verse 30, bookends it with the adultery passage. A man does not take his father's wife, so he will not uncover his father's skirt. In fact, the Hebrew text has this as the beginning of chapter 23. And we've seen laws like this before, again, in Leviticus 18 and 20, so I'm not going to get too into detail with that. Any comments or questions up through the end of chapter 22? Oh? All right. And that timed perfectly. We're at the end of class now. We'll pick up with chapter 23 next time.